The Texas sun beat down on Samuel Morrison's neck, hot and heavy like a brand. He stood at the edge of the crowd, the dust from the town square sticking to the sweat on his skin. Up on the auction block, where they usually sold cattle and horses, a different kind of merchandise was on display today. Human beings. His hands, rough and calloused from years of ranch work, squeezed the brim of his hat until his knuckles turned bone white. He was only 38, but the grief of the last 6 months had carved deep lines into his face, making him look like a man twice his age. 6 months. 6 months since the fire had swallowed his whole world, taking his wife, Rebecca, and their 6 children in one horrifying night of smoke and screams. He wasn't here to buy anyone. He could barely keep his own small ranch from going under. But Sheriff Williams had pulled him aside earlier, mentioned a young woman whose situation was complicated, sold by her own family. The sheriff knew Samuel had a soft spot for lost causes, a weakness he couldn't afford, but couldn't shake either. The auctioneer, a man named Hicks, with a voice like a booming cannon, climbed the wooden steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, silencing the crowd, "we begin today's proceedings with an individual whose circumstances require immediate resolution. Maria Elena Castillo, aged 19. A young woman was led onto the platform, and Samuel's breath caught in his throat. She was pregnant, very pregnant. Her belly swelled under a worn, loose-fitting dress. Her dark hair was pulled back, but loose strands framed a face that was stained with recent tears. But it was the way she held herself that hit Samuel like a physical blow. Head high, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the jeering crowd, a quiet dignity that screamed defiance. It was the same look Rebecca always had when things got tough. His Rebecca. "Miss Castillo comes with a clean bill of health," Hicks droned on, his voice cold and businesslike. "Experience with housework, cooking, and needlework. The child she carries is due in approximately 3 months." He paused, letting the information sink in. A pregnant worker. A complicated purchase. Bidding starts at $50. $50. Samuel had paid more for a decent saddle. His mind reeled. He saw the predators in the crowd sizing her up. Marcus Whitfield, a rich rancher known for his cruelty, was licking his lips. The Brennan brothers, who ran the saloon, were whispering to each other, their intentions ugly and clear. Samuel's stomach churned. He knew exactly what kind of life awaited this woman if one of them placed the winning bid. On the platform, Maria Elena's hands rested protectively over her unborn child. Her lips moved in a silent prayer. And seeing that small, desperate act of a mother protecting her baby shattered the wall of ice Samuel had built round his heart. "Do I hear $50? Hicks called out. The silence stretched. No one wanted to take on a pregnant woman, the extra expense, the lost work time. Samuel should have turned and walked away. He had nothing to offer. He had his own ghost to wrestle with, 6 small graves behind his house that he visited every single day. $40, a voice from the crowd finally called. 45, 50, 55. The bids climbed, each one a nail in the coffin of this young woman's future. Samuel watched her face. She seemed to shrink with every new offer, her body swaying slightly from the heat and exhaustion. He saw Marcus Whitfield raise his hand, his voice thick with confidence. $75. That would be it, Samuel thought. No one would top that. He saw Whitfield's smug smile, saw the fear that flashed across Maria Elena's face. He remembered the promise he'd made to Rebecca on their wedding day, that they would always stand for those who couldn't stand for themselves. He heard her voice in his head, as clear as if she were standing right beside him. "You can't save everyone, Sam, but you can save someone." "Going once at $75, Hicks announced, his gavel raised high. Samuel closed his eyes. The faces of his children flashed behind his eyelids. Thomas, Sarah, the twins Mary and Martha, little David, and baby Anna. They would have loved a new baby in the house. Going twice? The words ripped out of his throat before he even knew he was going to say them. $100. Every single head in that square swiveled to face him. The silence was deafening. $100 was a fortune. It was money he didn't have. It was a promise he couldn't possibly keep. Whitfield's face turned a shade of angry purple. "Sam Morrison," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You can barely afford to feed yourself. What are you going to do with a pregnant woman and her bastard child? The crowd murmured. Samuel felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on him, judging him, scorning him. But he also felt something else, a flicker of the man he used to be, the man Rebecca had married. He pushed through the crowd until he was standing at the front. My finances are my own business, Marcus, Samuel said, his voice surprisingly steady. 110, Whitfield snarled back, refusing to be beaten. Samuel looked up at Maria Elena. For the first time, her eyes met his. And in her gaze, he saw it again. That unbreakable strength, that flicker of hope against all odds. It was Rebecca's look. In that single fleeting moment, the crushing weight of his grief seemed to lift, just for a second, making room for something new. 125, he said, his voice ringing out across the silent square. The crowd gasped. Whitfield stared, his mouth hanging open. He could buy a dozen women for that price. Women without the complication of a child on the way. He shook his head in disgust and stormed away. Going once, Fricks called, looking around. Going twice. The gavel fell with a crack that sealed Samuel's fate. Sold to Samuel Morrison for $125. The crowd started to buzz, talking about the crazy widower who just bankrupted himself for a pregnant stranger. Samuel stood there frozen, the reality of what he'd just done washing over him like a cold tide. He was ruined. He was responsible for 2 new lives he had no way of providing for. He had acted on pure, raw emotion, driven by the ghost of his dead wife. But as he watched Maria Elena being helped down from the platform, her movements slow and careful, he felt something he hadn't felt in 6 long months. Not regret. Not even for a second. He approached her slowly, hat in hand. The way Rebecca had taught him was proper when addressing a lady. Up close, he could see the deep exhaustion in her dark eyes, the fine lines of worry etched around her mouth. She was just a girl, really, 19, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of hardship. Miss Castillo, he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. My name is Samuel Morrison. She just stared at him, her expression a careful, unreadable mask. You are the one, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. Why? The single word cut right through him. Why? He could have lied. He could have said he needed help on the ranch. But he was tired of lies, tired of the emptiness that had become his life. He looked into her eyes, the same deep brown as Rebecca's, and told her the simple, complicated truth. Because everyone deserves a choice, he said, and it seemed like you weren't going to get one otherwise. Her mask flickered for a moment. And what choice do I have now? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. I am still bought. I still belong to a stranger. Her words hit him harder than Whitfield's fist ever could have. He'd been so focused on saving her from the wolves, he hadn't considered that to her, he was just a different kind of wolf. No, he said, his voice firm. That's not how this works. I didn't buy you to own you. He took a deep breath. I have a ranch about 5 miles from here. It's quiet now. I lost my family. It's just me. He fumbled for the right words, realizing he hadn't thought this far ahead. I need help with the house. Cooking, cleaning. Things my wife used to do. In exchange, you'll have a roof over your head, food to eat, a safe place for you and your baby. And when the time comes, you'll be free to go. Or free to stay. The choice, he repeated, will be yours. She studied his face for a long time, searching for the lie, for the trap. He could see the years of betrayal and disappointment in her gaze. Finally, after a moment that stretched into an eternity, she gave a single, sharp nod. Then I choose to come with you, she said, for now. As they walked to his wagon, the legal papers from the sheriff's office felt like a mockery in his pocket. In the eyes of the law, she was his property. But as he helped her up onto the wagon seat, he made a silent promise, not just to her, but to the memory of Rebecca. This wasn't a prison. This was a sanctuary. The ride to the ranch was quiet. As they crested the last hill, the farmhouse came into view, a lonely silhouette against the blood-red sunset. From a distance, it looked the same. But as they got closer, she would see the truth. The peeling paint, the overgrown garden, the swing hanging still and silent from the old oak tree. The house wasn't just empty, it was hollowed out by grief, just like him. "It's bigger than I expected," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My wife, Rebecca," he said, the name feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. "She used to say we built it for a dozen children, not just 6. Maria Elena turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "You had 6 children?" The question was a punch to the gut. He tightened his grip on the reins, his throat suddenly tight. "Yes," he managed to choke out. "6. What happened to them?" The wagon wheels creaked, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden silence. He guided the horse toward the barn, the image of flames and smoke filling his mind. "Fire," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "I was out, checking the fence line. By the time I got back—" He couldn't finish. He never could. Her hand, small and warm, rested on his arm for just a moment. "I am sorry," she said softly. Then with a flash of understanding that stunned him, she added, "That is why. You have empty rooms." He helped her down from the wagon, the scent of Rebecca's honeysuckle vines, now wild and untamed, filling the air. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly because no one should have to face the world alone." He braced himself as he opened the back door, preparing for her reaction to the state of his home. The kitchen was a disaster. Dishes piled in the sink, dust coating every surface. It was the home of a man who had given up. Maria Elena stepped inside, her eyes taking in the chaos. Samuel waited for the judgment, the disgust. Instead, she took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the room with a practiced eye. Then she did something that completely floored him. She started rolling up her sleeves. "Where?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. "Do you keep the cleaning supplies?" "Maria Elena, you don't have to—" "Yes," she said, cutting him off, and for the first time, he saw a fire in her eyes that matched the one that had taken his family. "I do. You gave me a choice, Senior Morrison, and I choose to earn my place. I will not be a charity case." He wanted to argue, to tell her to rest, but he saw in her gaze that this was about more than a dirty kitchen. It was about dignity. It was about taking back some small piece of control in a life that had been stolen from her. He pointed to the cabinet under the sink. "In there," he said quietly. And just like that, in the middle of his broken-down kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, this pregnant stranger began to put his world back together. She started by washing the dishes, the clatter of plates and silverware, a sound of life in a house that had been silent for too long. She worked with a quiet, fierce efficiency that was mesmerizing. Samuel found himself taking orders, fetching water, scrubbing floors, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't known in months. As the afternoon light softened, the house began to change. The kitchen gleamed. The dust vanished. The scent of lemon soap replaced the stale air of grief. That evening, they sat down to a simple meal she had conjured from his nearly empty pantry. Vegetable soup and fresh bread. It was the first real meal eaten at that table since the fire. "You shouldn't have done all this," he said, the food tasting like a miracle. "I needed to know," she replied, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the checkered curtains Rebecca had sewn, the marks on the wooden table where their children had done their homework. "Know what?" She met his gaze, her expression serious. "Whether this place could feel like home." Later he showed her to the guest room, but on the way they passed the closed doors of the children's rooms. He hesitated, not wanting to cause her more pain. "Are these—" she asked softly. He nodded, his throat tight, and pushed open the door to what had been Thomas and Sarah's room. The beds were still perfectly made. The wooden toys he'd carved with his son sat on the shelf. A rag doll lay on a small rocking chair. The air was thick with memories. "How old were they?" she whispered. "Thomas was 8, Sarah 6, the twins 4, David was 2, and Anna was 6 months. Maria Elena walked to the window, looking out at the 6 small crosses under the oak tree. "You buried them here." "Rebecca wanted them close," he said, his voice cracking. "She said, 'Home is wherever your family is.'" She turned from the window, her eyes filled with a compassion that undid him. "You feel guilty," she stated, not unkindly. "You think you should have been here." The accusation, spoken so plainly, hung in the air. I was checking a fence a mile away while my family burned, he said, the words tasting like ash. I failed them. No, she said, her voice suddenly sharp, intense. You survived. My parents died of yellow fever. I was in the fields. Was I supposed to die with them? My uncle sold me because he said I was a burden. Was I supposed to throw myself in the river? She took a step closer, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Survival is not a sin, Senor Morrison. Sometimes just choosing to live is the bravest thing a person can do. Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. For 6 months he'd believed his survival was a betrayal. But looking at this woman, who had been through hell and was still standing, still fighting for the life inside her, he felt a profound shift in his soul. Maybe she was right. Maybe living wasn't a failure. The baby, he said, the question he'd been avoiding finally surfacing. The father, her face shuddered, the warmth in her eyes replaced by a wall of ice. There is no father, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. This child is mine, only mine. He saw the pain behind the wall, the story she wasn't telling, and knew not to push. He had his own ghosts. She was entitled to hers. Later that night, lying in his cold, empty bed, Samuel listened to the sounds of another person in his house. The creak of floorboards, the soft splash of water, the quiet hum of a lullaby being sung to an unborn child. They were sounds of life, sounds he thought he'd never hear again. The next morning he woke to the smell of coffee. He walked into the kitchen to find Maria Elena at the stove, a simple breakfast prepared. It felt so normal, so domestic, that it almost broke him. As he was getting ready to ride out, she handed him a cloth bundle. I packed you a lunch, she said simply. A man who works a ranch needs to eat. He rode out to the pastures, the weight of the bundled lunch in his saddlebag feeling heavier than it should. As he checked on his cattle, his mind kept replaying her words, her actions. There was something about her that didn't add up. Her English was too perfect. The way she moved, the way she organized the kitchen. It spoke of a life far different from that of a poor, indebted orphan. She wasn't just a survivor, she was something more. He returned to the ranch early that afternoon, intending to help her with the garden she'd started clearing. But as he dismounted, a sound drifted from the parlor window that stopped him dead in his tracks. Music. Someone was playing the piano, and not just playing. The melody was complex, heartbreakingly beautiful, played with a skill that spoke of years of practice. Rebecca had played, but never like this. This was the music of a concert hall, not a dusty Texas farmhouse. He crept to the window and peered inside. It was Maria Elena. Her eyes were closed, her fingers dancing across the keys, her face transformed by a look of pure, transcendent peace. She was a million miles away from the auction block, from this broken-down ranch. She was back in a world he couldn't imagine. The music stopped as she sensed his presence. She turned, her face instantly reverting to its usual guarded expression. He walked inside. That was beautiful, he said quietly. She busied herself at the counter, not looking at him. I was just checking if it was in tune. Maria Elena, he said gently. That was more than checking the tuning. She finally stopped, setting her knife down. She turned to face him, her shoulders slumped in resignation. My family, she said, her voice low, was not always poor. Before the fever, before the debts, I had tutors. I had lessons. I had a different life. The pieces clicked into place. The grace, the language, the quiet dignity. She wasn't born into this hardship. She had fallen into it. And the baby's father? He asked, his voice softer this time. Was he part of that other life? Her eyes flashed with a pain so raw it made him flinch. There is no father, she repeated, her voice like steel. Some stories don't have heroes, Senor Morrison. Some just have survivors. That night, as the house settled into a quiet rhythm, he heard it again. The soft, hesitant notes of the piano. She was playing, not with the confident flourish of the afternoon, but with a gentle, searching quality. It sounded like someone trying to remember who they were. And listening to that music, Samuel realized something. This house wasn't just a sanctuary for her. She was bringing it back to life. She was filling the empty rooms, not just with her presence, but with hope. And in doing so, she was doing the same for him. The third week brought the devil to their doorstep. It came in the form of a polished black carriage, pulled by two matching black horses, looking completely out of place in his dusty yard. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his face soft and pale, his eyes cold and calculating. "Mr. Morrison," he said, extending a hand Samuel had no desire to shake. "I am Reginald Ashworth, attorney at law. I believe you are in possession of something that belongs to my client." Ice flooded Samuel's veins. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Ashworth said with a thin, cruel smile. "I'm here for Maria Elena Castillo." Samuel felt a primal urge to protect, the same feeling he'd had watching the wolves circle her at the auction. "She's not a piece of property." "The law, I'm afraid, disagrees," Ashworth said smoothly. He pulled a document from his coat. "This is a betrothal contract, signed by Miss Castillo's father 2 years ago, promising her in marriage to my client, Mr. Harrison Blackwell." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Harrison Blackwell, a cattle baron who owned half the state, a man with a reputation as dark and ugly as a Texas thunderstorm, a man whose first two wives had died in very convenient, very suspicious accidents. "She never agreed to that," Samuel said, his voice shaking with rage. "Her agreement was not required," Ashworth replied coolly. "Her father made a binding contract. She belongs to Mr. Blackwell. Your purchase at the auction was, therefore, invalid." Just then, Maria Elena stepped out onto the porch. Her face went deathly pale when she saw the carriage and the man standing beside it. "Signor Ashworth," she said, her voice a tight whisper. "I wondered when he would find me." The lawyer gave a mock bow. "Mr. Blackwell has been very worried about you, my dear. He is eager to welcome you home." "This is my home," she said, taking a step back, her hand flying to her belly. "Not anymore," Ashworth said, his voice hardening. "Mr. Blackwell is a patient man, but his patience has run out. He is prepared to take you back, by force if necessary. He has a court order. The sheriff's deputies will assist him. Anyone who interferes," he said, looking directly at Samuel, "will be charged with theft and obstruction of justice." The trap was closing in. This wasn't just some greedy rancher. This was a powerful, ruthless man with the law in his pocket. "How much?" Maria Elena asked, her voice trembling. "How much did my father sell me for?" Ashworth consulted another paper. $5,000, in advance on the marriage contract to settle your family's debts. $5,000, an impossible sum. It was a death sentence. "Mr. Blackwell will be here in 2 days to collect his property," Ashworth said, turning to leave. "I suggest you have her ready." As the carriage disappeared in a cloud of dust, Samuel and Maria Elena stood on the porch in stunned silence. The fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered. "You knew," Samuel said. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I hoped he would never find me. I was a fool." "Who is he to you?" Samuel asked, dreading the answer. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a terror that went beyond a forced marriage. "He visited our ranch," she whispered. "Before my parents died. He would sit and talk business with my father, but he wasn't looking at the cattle ledgers." Her voice broke. "He was looking at me, like something he already owned." The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. "Maria Elena," he said, his voice barely audible. "The baby," she finally broke, the sobs racking her small frame. "There is no father," she cried, repeating the desperate lie. "There is only a monster who took what he believed was already his." Samuel pulled her into his arms, his heart breaking for her, a white-hot rage building inside him. The man who had violated her, the man who had created this precious, innocent life in an act of violence, was coming to claim them both. "He will not take you," Samuel swore, his voice a low growl. "I will not let him. I will die first." She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with despair. "How can we fight him, Samuel? The law, the money, the power. It is all on his side." "Then to hell with the law," he said, a cold, hard certainty settling in his soul. He had already lost one family. He would not lose another. We run. That night, Samuel rode into town under the cover of darkness, a desperate plan forming in his mind. He found Sheriff Williams and laid out the whole ugly story, the betrothal contract, the truth about the baby. The sheriff listened, his face grim. I've heard stories about Blackwell, he said, things that don't get investigated because he owns too many people. If she goes back to him, she won't last a year. Then help me, Samuel pleaded. Williams stared at the contract. Legally, my hands are tied. If I interfere, he'll have my badge. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. But what if Maria Elena Castillo ceased to exist? The idea was insane. It was dangerous. It was their only hope. What are you saying? I'm saying we stage her death, the sheriff said, his eyes hard as flint. We get Doc Patterson to sign a death certificate. Complications from childbirth. We hold a funeral, bury an empty coffin, and by the time Blackwell realizes what's happened, Maria Elena Castillo will be gone. And a new woman, with a new name and new papers, will be on her way to a new life. The risk was enormous. If they were caught, they would both go to prison. But the alternative was unthinkable. When Samuel returned to the ranch, he found Maria Elena sitting in the dark, staring out the window. He told her the plan. You would do this for me? She whispered, her eyes searching his. Risk your freedom? Your life? He took her hands in his. Maria Elena, in these last few weeks, this house has started to feel like a home again. You have started to feel like... He couldn't say the word. It was too soon, too complicated. I know enough, he said instead. I know I won't let him have you. Her thumb gently stroked the back of his hand. Samuel, she said, using his first name for the first time, I am carrying another man's child, a child born of violence. Can you live with that? He thought of his own children. He thought of this tiny, innocent life she was carrying. That child is part of you, he said, his voice thick with emotion, and that makes him, or her, precious. A father isn't about blood, Maria Elena. It's about love. It's about showing up. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of fear. Then we do it, she said, her voice filled with a new fragile hope. We become criminals, together. They spent the next day making preparations, a current of frantic energy running between them. Sheriff Williams arranged for forged papers from a contact in Austin. Doc Patterson agreed to the ruse without a second's hesitation. The plan was set. In 3 days, Maria Elena Castillo would die, and Elena Martinez, a widow from Mexico, would be born. But they didn't have 3 days. They didn't even have one, because Harrison Blackwell was not a patient man, and he was closer than they knew. From a line of trees on the ridge overlooking the ranch, he watched them through a spyglass, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw them talking, saw Samuel take her hand, and a possessive rage, black and venomous, consumed him. He's touching my property, Blackwell growled to Ashworth, who sat nervously beside him. The law is too slow. We're going to collect what's mine. Tonight. That evening, as Samuel and Maria Elena sat at the kitchen table, finalizing their desperate escape, they heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Samuel looked out the window and his blood ran cold. A dozen riders armed to the teeth were surrounding the house, and at their head a man whose sheer size and presence radiated pure menace. Harrison Blackwell had come for his bride. Get in the cellar, Samuel hissed, grabbing the rifle from above the mantel. But it was too late. The front door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges. Blackwell filled the doorway, his eyes locking on Maria Elena with a terrifying intensity. There you are, he said, his voice a low rumble. My wayward bride. Did you think you could hide from me? Samuel stepped between them, the rifle leveled at Blackwell's chest. Get out of my house! Blackwell laughed, a horrible grating sound. This is my house now, and she is my wife. His armed men flooded into the room surrounding them. Samuel knew, with sickening certainty, that he couldn't win this fight. Please, Maria Elena begged, stepping forward. Harrison, don't do this. I'll go with you. Just don't hurt him. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. He strode forward and backhanded her across the face, the sound of the blow echoing in the silent room. She crumpled to the floor. A red haze of fury descended over Samuel. He lunged, but two of Blackwell's men slammed him against the wall, pinning him, the rifle clattering to the floor. "You will learn to obey me," Blackwell snarled, standing over Maria Elena. "And you," he said, turning his cold gaze on Samuel, "will learn not to touch what belongs to me." He drove his fist into Samuel's stomach again and again. Samuel gasped for air, his vision swimming. Through the pain, he saw Maria Elena struggling to her feet. "Stop!" she screamed. "I'll do anything! Please!" Blackwell paused, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Anything?" He looked from her to Samuel, an idea taking shape in his twisted mind. He pulled his own pistol from his belt and held it out to her. "Prove it," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Prove your loyalty. Kill him." The room fell silent. Maria Elena stared at the gun, then at Samuel, her face a mask of horror. I can't," she whispered. "Then he dies anyway," Blackwell said, cocking the hammer of his own pistol and pressing it to Samuel's temple. "And you get to watch. Choose." Samuel looked into Maria Elena's eyes. He saw the impossible choice tearing her apart. He saw the love and the fear and the desperation, and he made a choice of his own. "Do it, Maria Elena," he said, his voice calm and clear over the pounding in his head. "Save yourself. Save the baby." "No, Samuel, I won't," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Do it," he commanded. With a sob that ripped from the depths of her soul, she took the pistol. Her hand trembled violently as she raised it, aiming it straight at his heart. Samuel closed his eyes, thinking of Rebecca, of his children, of this brave, broken woman who had brought light back into his life. He braced himself for the end. The shot, when it came, was deafening. But it wasn't Samuel who fell. In the split second before she pulled the trigger, the kitchen door burst open. Sheriff Williams and 3 deputies stormed in, guns drawn. The bullet from Maria Elena's pistol, fired in that chaotic moment, missed Samuel completely and shattered the oil lamp on the mantelpiece, plunging half the room into darkness. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides. The room filled with smoke and the screams of men. Samuel, freed when his captors turned to face the lawmen, tackled Maria Elena, shielding her with his body as bullets ripped through the air above them. "The root cellar!" he yelled over the din. "Behind the pantry!" They scrambled across the floor, splinters flying around them. Samuel shoved her through the pantry door and ripped open the trap door to the cellar just as Blackwell's enraged roar filled the house. "They're getting away! Find them!" Samuel helped her down the ladder into the cool darkness below, then pulled the trap door shut just as heavy boots stomped into the pantry above. They were trapped. Then Maria Elena cried out, a sharp gasp of pain. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "The baby. I think the baby is coming." A contraction, hard and fast, seized her. She was in labor, 2 months early, in the middle of a gunfight. "Williams!" Samuel yelled, his voice raw. "We're in the cellar. Maria Elena's in labor." Above them, the gunfire subsided, replaced by shouts and the sound of men surrendering. But Blackwell was not giving up. They could hear him rampaging through the house, smashing furniture, roaring her name. "I know you're in here," he bellowed. "Come out, or I'll burn this house to the ground with you in it." Samuel's blood ran cold. The fire, the memory of the smoke, the heat, the screams. It was happening again. Another contraction ripped through Maria Elena, and this one was followed by a gush of water. It was happening. Now. "Harrison Blackwell," William's voice boomed from just outside the pantry. "This is your last chance. Surrender now." "Never!" Blackwell roared back. "She is mine!" They heard a splintering crash. He had found the trapdoor. "Samuel," Maria Elena gasped, her face pale in the dim light. "He can't get the baby." "He won't," Samuel said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He looked at Maria Elena, her body racked with pain, but her eyes filled with fierce maternal fire. He looked at the flimsy wooden door that was the only thing between them and a monster. He had failed to save his family once. He would not fail again. He kissed her forehead. "I love you," he whispered, the words finally breaking free. Then before she could protest, he turned and shoved open the trap door, climbing out of the darkness and into the line of fire. Blackwell stood there, his face a twisted mask of rage, a pistol in each hand. "There you are," he snarled. "It's over, Blackwell," Samuel said, standing tall, his body blocking the entrance to the cellar. "You want her? You'll have to go through me." Blackwell laughed, a chilling, unhinged sound. "With pleasure." From the cellar below, the first cry of a newborn baby pierced the tense silence. A girl, a tiny, premature, but fiercely alive baby girl. The sound seemed to snap the last thread of Blackwell's sanity. He raised both pistols, his eyes wild with fury. Time seemed to slow down. Samuel saw the sheriff raising his rifle. He saw the flash from the barrels of Blackwell's guns. He heard Maria Elena scream his name. And then a final, deafening volley of gunfire filled the small house. For a moment, there was only ringing silence. Samuel stood, untouched, staring at the body of Harrison Blackwell sprawled on the floor, Sheriff Williams's rifle still smoking. "He gave me no choice," the sheriff said grimly. But Samuel barely heard him. He was already scrambling back down the ladder. Maria Elena lay exhausted against the damp earth wall, cradling a tiny, perfect infant in her arms. "A girl," she whispered, tears of pain and joy streaming down her face. "We have a daughter." Samuel knelt, his rough finger gently touching the baby's cheek. She was so small, so fragile. And in that moment, looking at his new daughter and the woman who had brought her into the world, the last of the ice around Samuel's heart melted away, and he wept. The next few weeks were a blur of healing. The federal marshals descended on the Blackwell Empire, uncovering a web of corruption and human trafficking that shocked the state. The betrothal contract, and dozens like it, were declared void. Maria Elena Castillo was officially declared dead, and Elena Morrison was given a new life, a new name, and a future free from fear. And the baby, their tiny, premature miracle, grew stronger every day. They named her Hope. 1 year later, Samuel stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch. The paint was fresh, the garden was blooming, and the sound of a child's laughter drifted from the yard. Hope, now a sturdy toddler, chased butterflies near the old oak tree, her dark hair shining in the sun. Elena came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. The piano music she played every evening now filled their home, a melody of resilience and peace. "She has your eyes," Elena said softly. "She has her mother's strength," Samuel replied, pulling her close. He looked out at the 6 small crosses on the hill, no longer a place of just sorrow, but a reminder of the love that had shaped him. He had lost one family to fire and fate, but from the ashes, another had been born. A family forged not by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by a love powerful enough to defy death itself. He had walked into an auction a broken man, intending to buy nothing. Instead, he had bought back his own soul. He had saved a stranger, and in doing so, he had saved himself. And as he watched his daughter laugh in the Texas sunlight, Samuel Morrison finally understood. Home wasn't a place you lost. It was a place you built again and again with whoever was brave enough to build it with you. This story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. If it touched your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we have coming up are ones you won't want to miss. And in the comments below, let us know, what's the bravest thing you've ever done for someone you love? We'll see you in the next one.